Earlier, I mentioned the popularity of transformation stories, particularly those about superheroes. Let's recall Batman, who, as Bruce Wayne, lives a measured, dull, proper life. He doesn't need any concoction to transform into his Mr. Hyde, Batman. The same goes for Superman, who disguises himself as the ordinary Clark Kent. The story of Tony Stark, Iron Man, is particularly interesting, as it features a superhero variation of the rags to riches plot, since Stark invented the technology for his transformation himself. Once you start looking for transformation stories, you'll find them everywhere. They've become a culturally acceptable way to try on different personas. A testament to this is the popularity of cosplay and role-playing games. One might argue that in these cases, a person knows that their image is just a fantasy, and the activity is simply a game. Really, many participants at Comic-Con or the Burning Man festival prepare for the event almost all year. The question arises as to what defines their self-perception, work and daily life, or the festival, or perhaps both. Until now, I've discussed how our brain uses narratives as templates for interpreting the world we live in. These narratives arise from our own experiences, but they are also layered over by the stories we hear from childhood and throughout our lives. In the following chapters, we'll explore some fairly common types of narratives that repeatedly appear in the stories we internalize. We involuntarily graft our own experiences onto these ubiquitous narratives. The plots of multiple personalities are variations on some of the common themes, and as I've mentioned, I believe each of us has a place on the dissociative spectrum. To some degree, all of us transform into different personalities. Like switching between channels, we toggle between different narrative flows in our heads, each of which carves its path through the past, present, and future. Chapter 7. The Evolution of Narrative. It should now be clear that the brain deceives us in various ways. Among its tricks is the ability to dissociate and perceive events as if from the outside. It also includes compression, the ability to store events and experiences in a space-saving format, allowing us to recall episodic memories. Finally, the brain has a cunning ability to shift time. Even when it seems like we are experiencing something in the here and now, we are actually processing information about past events. This last trick has served the brain's evolution, which is geared toward staying one step ahead of the external world, constantly predicting what's coming next. These three strategies, dissociation, compression, and prediction, are the three pillars of personal narrative. Each of these processes had its reasons for development, and all three strategies can be found in some form in nearly every mammal. In humans, they form a unique combination that allows us to build the narrative of our lives. Of course, with stories, we also describe what happens to others, but what matters most to us is our own narrative. When thinking about who we are, we generally turn to the narrative version of our life, a continuous story about our origins, occupation, spouses, children, etc. As we've seen in the case of multiple personalities, the three pillars can manifest differently, creating many different narratives. Whatever you consider your fundamental personal narrative to be, it represents just one of many probable versions. To understand how these stories are formed in our consciousness, let's analyze the narrative process itself. At first glance, a narrative seems magical. Magical thinking, at least. Here comes a series of events. Whether there is a cause and effect relationship between them is irrelevant because the brain will connect them anyway. This is where we, scientists, raise our fingers and proclaim that following doesn't mean causality, correlation is not causation. This cognitive error should be the emblem of false reasoning. As we all know, if one event occurs after another, it doesn't necessarily mean the second was caused by the first. Earlier, I mentioned the popularity of transformation stories, particularly those involving superheroes. Let's recall Batman, who, as Bruce Wayne, lives a measured, dull, proper life. He doesn't need any concoction to transform into his Mr. Hyde, Batman. The same goes for Superman, who disguises himself as the ordinary Clark Kent. The story of Tony Stark, Iron Man, is particularly interesting, as it features a superhero variation of the rags to riches plot, since Stark invented the technology for his transformation himself. Once you start looking for transformation stories, you'll find them everywhere. They've become a culturally acceptable way to try on different personas. A testament to this is the popularity of cosplay and role-playing games. One might argue that in these cases, a person knows that their image is just a fantasy, and the activity is simply a game. Really, many participants at Comic-Con or the Burning Man festival prepare for the event almost all year. The question arises as to what defines their self-perception, work and daily life, or the festival, or perhaps both. Until now, I've discussed how our brain uses narratives as templates for interpreting the world we live in. These narratives arise from our own experiences, but they are also layered over by the stories we hear from childhood and throughout our lives. In the following chapters, we'll explore some fairly common types of narratives that are repeatedly found in the stories we internalize. We involuntarily graft our own experiences onto these ubiquitous narratives. The plots of multiple personalities are variations on some of the common themes, and as I've mentioned, I believe each of us has a place on the dissociative spectrum. To some degree, all of us transform into different personalities. Like switching between channels, we toggle between different narrative flows in our heads, each of which carves its path through the past, present, and future. Chapter 7. The Evolution of Narrative. It should now be clear that the brain deceives us in various ways. Among its tricks is the ability to dissociate and perceive events as if from the outside. It also includes compression, the ability to store events and experiences in a space-saving format, allowing us to recall episodic memories. Finally, the brain has a cunning ability to shift time. Even when it seems like we are experiencing something in the here and now, we are actually processing information about past events. This last trick has served the brain's evolution, which is geared toward staying one step ahead of the external world, constantly predicting what's coming next. These three strategies, dissociation, compression, and prediction, are the three pillars of personal narrative. Each of these processes had its reasons for development, and all three strategies can be found in some form in nearly every mammal. In humans, they form a unique combination that allows us to build the narrative of our lives. Of course, with stories, we also describe what happens to others, but what matters most to us is our own narrative. When thinking about who we are, we generally turn to the narrative version of our life, a continuous story about our origins, occupation, spouses, children, etc. As we've seen in the case of multiple personalities, the three pillars can manifest differently, creating many different narratives. Whatever you consider your fundamental personal narrative to be, it represents just one of many probable versions. To understand how these stories are formed in our consciousness, let's analyze the narrative process itself. At first glance, a narrative seems magical. Magical thinking, at least. Here comes a series of events. Whether there is a cause and effect relationship between them is irrelevant because the brain will connect them anyway. This is where we, scientists, raise our fingers and proclaim that following doesn't mean causality, correlation is not causation. This cognitive error should be the emblem of false reasoning. As we all know, if one event occurs after another, it doesn't necessarily mean the second was caused by the first. The ubiquitous nature of the monomyth should not be underestimated. It doesn't matter whether we are watching TV, diving into a book, or even, for example, reading the news, almost any story presented to us will strictly adhere to the three-act structure. This is what our brains expect. Stories that deviate from this structure create cognitive dissonance. A single, isolated deviation might be tolerable, but systematic deviation is not. Whether we like it or not, we inevitably return to the appealing concept that life is a journey. The hero's journey becomes the leading motif in our perception of ourselves. And since this story is embedded in our brains from early childhood, its structure overlays everything we perceive and ultimately remember. The hero's journey is not just the first story we hear in childhood, it is the first story of humanity itself. So ancient that it might be the first cultural artifact embedded into our brains. This is easy to check, just look at the earliest story we have recorded in writing. This narrative is a perfect example of the hero's journey, which can be seen as an adventure in 3 acts. In the first act, we are introduced to Gilgamesh, the ruler of Uruk and son of the gods. We learn that Gilgamesh is revered above all previous kings. He is the wisest and strongest man alive, and, as the ruler, he exercises the right of the first night with all foreign brides. His subjects, weary of being forced to give up their daughters for defilement, appeal to the gods. In response to these pleas, the gods create Enkidu, a rival equal in strength to Gilgamesh. Enkidu is born in the wilderness, knows no clothes, and befriends wild animals. When word reaches Gilgamesh about this wild savage, he sends the temple prostitute Shamhat to seduce Enkidu. For 7 days, he indulges in carnal pleasures, but then the animal friends flee from him, and he is forced to leave the wilds. On his way to Uruk, Enkidu meets a shepherd who tells him how Gilgamesh treats the daughters of his subjects. Enraged, Enkidu fights Gilgamesh, but the latter proves too strong, and Enkidu is forced to admit defeat. After this, Gilgamesh and Enkidu become the best of friends. In the second act, Gilgamesh decides to take Enkidu with him to battle Humbaba, a giant monster who guards the cedar forest. Humbaba tries to scare the heroes away with terrifying roars from the mountaintop and earthquakes. Confronting Humbaba in battle, Gilgamesh calls upon his friends, the gods. The most powerful of them, the sun god Shamash, sends all the winds in the world to Gilgamesh, including tornadoes, typhoons, and dust storms. Humbaba cannot withstand this, and Gilgamesh succeeds in killing him. Seeing what Gilgamesh is capable of, the goddess of love, Ishtar, becomes infatuated with him and desires to marry him and bear his children, but Gilgamesh rejects her. Enraged, Ishtar tries to curse him, but misses. The curse, passing over Gilgamesh, falls on his friend. Enkidu develops a fever, and after 12 days he dies. In the third act, Gilgamesh mourns the loss of his friend. Realizing his own mortality through this loss, he seeks a way to avoid death. He embarks on a quest to find Utnapishtim, the only man to survive the Great Flood and receive immortality from the gods. During these travels, when Gilgamesh meets Shamash, the sun god, he is puzzled as to why he continues searching for something that can never be found. And here we uncover the deeper meaning of any hero's journey. It is a man's battle with his own mortality. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we see obvious parallels with both the Odyssey and the Book of Genesis, reflecting their shared origin, the very stories that were told at the dawn of human civilization. And although the tale of Gilgamesh is the oldest recorded story, oral versions of Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, and the Book of Genesis were likely composed millennia earlier, perhaps from the time cities first emerged. It can be confidently stated that humanity has kept the story of the hero's journey in its memory at least since the appearance of the Epic of Gilgamesh about 5,000 years ago, although it is likely much older. For millennia, if viewed from the perspective of all of humanity and throughout life, from the perspective of an individual, we develop a response to this narrative of wandering. Our brain unconsciously adapts the interpretation of what is happening to this narrative scheme. In this story, there must be a main hero. An external event disrupts the course of his life, prompting him to take action. He strives to fulfill his desire, but must overcome various obstacles along the way. Ultimately, he faces a choice, and the result of this choice changes the hero forever. If we were to represent all 6 story types as graphs, their different trajectories would reflect the basic functions for most stories you've ever encountered. And while I believe that in our personal narrative, the hero's journey is the predominant plot type, it is quite possible, and even highly likely, that we also turn to other types of stories when our subpersonalities come into play. Different alter egos, like Mr. Hyde or Eva Black, which are opposites of the primary personalities, also need their own story, an alternative one. If the main personality follows the Cinderella plot, then the subpersonality will likely follow the narrative of Oedipus. 6 canonical story types. Reagan et al., The Emotional Arcs of Stories, 112. Although these stories are surely familiar to you, some small details may have slipped from your memory. But that doesn't matter. That's the amazing thing about stories. They pack a vast amount of information into a compact bundle. Great works do this so well that their main character embodies the entire plot. You may not remember how events unfolded in The Great Gatsby, but can you forget Jay Gatsby himself as the symbol of the futility of the American dream? Or Daisy Buchanan, carefree about everything except her belonging to the upper class? Some might say that these characters are just emblematic, representing the themes touched on by the author, but this is an oversimplification, a devaluation of unforgettable complex characters. I think the matter here is not symbolism, it's a bit deeper. This is a compressed reflection of a complex social struggle. These images are tightly packed in the storage of our memory, ready to unfold at a moment's notice whenever circumstances demand it. Thus, the key question is formulated as follows. How does a character become the main template for their own life narrative? Someone might argue that fictional characters serve only for entertainment, but as we have already seen, a skillfully crafted protagonist can influence the developing mind in extraordinary ways. In J. Asher's 2007 novel, 13 Reasons Why, the narrative of suffering reaches its peak, requiring action. In this incredibly popular work for high school students, we meet Hannah Baker, a girl who has committed suicide. Her story is told on 13 sides of 7 audio tapes, recorded by her before she took her life. She sends the box of tapes to her friend Clay Jensen with instructions to listen and pass them on. The instructions are prefaced with a warning that the tapes are copied, and if the box doesn't reach the last recipient, Mr. Porter, the teacher, the recordings will be released to the public. Switching between the narratives of Clay and Hannah, Asher paints a picture of the unbearable life of the high school girl. This picture includes the inevitable problems with boys, the bullying of vicious girls, as well as gossip and harassment. There's also sexual harassment. Hannah falls into depression and starts formulating suicidal plans. In the final recording, she hints at these feelings to Mr. Porter, causing him obvious concern. But Hannah accuses him of not being concerned enough to stop her. Hannah is doomed from the very beginning. Even before the narrative begins, she is already dead. There can be no triumphant return of the hero. With adult eyes, I see a depressed, self-absorbed girl facing the same problems as many teenagers, and of course, no one would justify suicide as an escape from this situation. The fact that Hannah is of vengeful nature, angry at the world, is evident even in her chosen way of telling her story. Why record all these tapes if not to torment the listeners? The mentioned narrative schemes, whether the hero's journey or any of the other 5 remaining plot types, form the core functions that allow us to link events over time. Even if we don't think about them every minute, ready-made narrative arcs serve as templates, connecting our past, present, and future. In other words, the story of who we think we are, which we are taught to perceive as unique and one of a kind, is in fact just a retelling of one of several widely spread motifs. By now, it should be clear that self-perception, the concept of self-identification, is a kind of illusion. Our idea of ourselves is a construct. We are physically different from who we were 10 years ago, and even our brains have changed significantly over that time, not allowing us to confidently claim that the physical substrate containing memories of our former I is solid ground. The unreliability and instability of human memory has been proven by many studies, painting quite a discouraging picture. The feeling of being the same person as all our versions from the past is mere fiction, an invention, an artificial narrative. As we've already seen, the tone of any experience is colored by expectations, which, in turn, are shaped by previous memories and the narratives we build to explain why everything happens the way it does and not otherwise. If our sense of self is shaped by the stories we internalize, how do we separate our own experiences from those we hear or read about? Teenagers find this most difficult because they simply don't have enough accumulated experiences that they could call their own. But even for adults, the line between self and others is not as clear-cut as one might think. In the next section of the book, we will learn how to peek into someone else's mind, and how this possibility blurs the boundary between our own thoughts and those of others. Part I and Others. Chapter 9. Shades of I. In the first part of the book, we explored what makes up and how our I is formed, examining why our self-image is a confabulation arising from the existential need to thread all the scattered versions of our personality over time into one continuous narrative. However, I is not only distributed over time. It expands and contracts depending on social demands. Humans are social creatures, which is why each of us has different versions of ourselves for work, home, friends, and family. These facets of our personality are not just reflections of different sides of us. Earlier, I mentioned cosplay, wondering which of the cosplayers' personas should be considered authentic, the gaming one or the one they assume at work. We already know that dissociation is a normal component of human experience, so it's no exaggeration to suggest that our perception of ourselves is dictated by the social context, possibly to the extent that we transform into an entirely different person when circumstances require it. Thus, the singular, I, is an illusion not only of continuity over time, but also of constancy in space, or rather, in the circles we move in, allowing us to consider ourselves the same person, regardless of who we interact with. However, this illusion slightly cracks, and if we pay attention to these cracks, we may learn something about the malleability of I. If the I is much more fluid than we imagine, the reason for this is the evolutionary necessity that has pressured us throughout history to coexist with one another. In the second part of this book, we will examine in more detail how the limitations imposed on us by our belonging to society lead to the exchange of ideas. Just as when perceiving and absorbing stories from books and films, this immediate and free circulation of ideas among people further blurs the boundaries between thoughts born in our own consciousness and those gleaned from others. In this whirlwind, unique to humans, the source of thoughts quickly loses clarity and becomes indistinguishable. Many animals are highly social, but only humans have evolved the ability to think about what others think, and it is this ability that allows us to easily incorporate others' ideas into our own. Scientists call this ability a model of mental state, MMS. As we will see, MMS is a powerful evolutionary adaptation as it enables people to collaborate. But it has a side effect in mixing personal thoughts into a common pot, from which they are then distributed to other members of the community. One could say that our brains have evolved to easily accept others' opinions. Evolution has brilliantly succeeded in selecting optimal strategies. According to the law of large numbers, a group has a higher probability of making an accurate judgment than any individual. Thus, in most situations, it is better to go along with the crowd than to try to swim against the current. And if, on average, the optimal, superior to any other strategy, course of action, involves following the crowd, this impulse has been deeply embedded by evolutionary forces in the functioning of our brain. Die-hard individualists may find this idea discouraging. However, I find it useful to view humans' tendency toward groupthink as a strength rather than a weakness. It is akin to the advice financial consultants give to invest in index funds rather than actively managed funds. How many times have we seen fund managers, soaring with astronomical returns, eventually return to the average benchmark? The further we go, the harder it becomes to maintain higher profits. It's simpler to invest in the broader market. Our brains instinctively understand this. But this instinctive knowledge is interfered with by the individualistic narrative we build in our minds. The hero must stop hiding in the crowd and embark on his own journey, carve his own paths, battle monsters, and eventually return with new knowledge and experience to share with the community. This is nothing more than a motivational myth, certainly useful, but still a myth. Our brain had another reason to evolve in the direction of similarity, not difference, with others. Consensus eases cooperation. The ability to see through others' eyes is one of the pillars of society, so essential that the inability or unwillingness to see someone else's point of view threatens the stability of that society. The problem of the individual's place in society was addressed by the Franco-Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his famous treatise, Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men, published in 1755. Describing the natural state of man as similar to that of other animals, i.e., solely concerned with personal survival. French amour de soi-même means self-love. Rousseau portrayed the natural man as a savage. But when this natural man encounters other such natural men, complications arise. Sooner or later, the natural man expands his personal interests to the environment around him. He stakes a claim on a piece of land and says, "This is mine." Rousseau argued that this act marked the emergence of society and human civilization, codifying class inequality, the division into the haves, those who own land, and the have-nots. According to Rousseau, this division obliges the wealthy to create a society that does not infringe on the freedom of the less fortunate. He calls this the social contract. Rousseau's works appeared at a pivotal moment in the Enlightenment. His writings, along with those of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, formed the foundation of the Declaration of Independence and fed the ideas of the American Revolution. King George, in essence, violated the social contract with the colonies. The only alternative was to form a new government, one that expressed the will of the people. In the hunt for deer, personal interests completely align with societal ones. Unlike another, much more famous classic thought experiment called the prisoner's dilemma, where personal interests and the common good are in complete opposition to each other. What is best for one is best for all. However, participants in the deer hunt do not always choose cooperation. The best course of action depends on what the second person decides. Either they jointly track the deer or catch a rabbit together. In game theory, such an optimal choice is called equilibrium, because anyone deciding to change the shared course towards one of these outcomes would only make it worse. But agreeing in the deer hunt is difficult. Even if everyone agrees on one of the two options, no participant can know for sure that the others will act as agreed. This uncertainty about how the other will actually behave is called strategic uncertainty. Distrust of one another pushes participants to disregard the optimal choice, the bird in the sky, in favor of the bird in the hand, in this case, the deer for the rabbit. But you might be asking, what does all this have to do with the illusion of I? The deer hunting dilemma regularly arises in modern life, reflecting our approach to calculating risks and showing whether we reason differently, and can therefore be considered as different personalities, when we focus solely on ourselves versus when we think about others. The deer hunt can be considered any activity that requires cooperation. To enjoy its fruits, each participant must contribute to the common good. On a larger scale, the inability to act collectively leads to the tragedy of the commons. The original example that coined this term concerns English shepherds allowing their flocks to graze on common land, as was customary for ages. If one shepherd increases their herd, they can earn more. But if everyone increases their herd, the land quickly becomes depleted, and all suffer. The tragedy, therefore, lies in destroying the common good for the sake of an individual. This dynamic is what drives the greatest threat to humanity, global warming. The tools borrowed from game theory to mathematically analyze the deer hunt help us understand why players might prefer one strategy over another. In its simplest form, the deer hunt is a two-player game. Each must choose whether to hunt rabbits or deer, and the outcome will depend on both players' actions. It doesn't matter whether the players are allowed to communicate, since people sometimes deceive each other. What matters here are actions, not words. According to game theory, an equilibrium in the deer hunt is only possible in two cases. Either both participants hunt deer or both chase rabbits. The deer represents the most rewarding outcome, so this equilibrium is called the dominant strategy by reward. The result with the rabbit, though offering a lesser reward, still minimizes the risk of returning empty-handed. This equilibrium is called the dominant strategy by risk. What the players will end up with depends on two factors: the value of deer compared to rabbits and each participant's tolerance for uncertainty. If the deer is much more valuable than the rabbit, the participants will tolerate the unpredictability of each other's actions. However, if the deer is only slightly more valuable, the risk is not justified. Economists argue whether strategic uncertainty is a manifestation of the general human attitude toward risk or a result of the tendency to trust others. There's also a third option. When we find ourselves in situations that require coordination with others, we transform, changing our perception to enter their minds. If we could study what happens in the brain during social decision-making, we would better understand which mechanism is more important for coordinating actions and to what extent a person changes, adapting to specific circumstances. In 2012, my laboratory set out to learn more about how a person's attitude toward risk changes when interacting with others. We wanted to use fMRI and the deer hunt game to estimate the difference between simple risk assessment and uncertainty related to the need to think about what others are thinking. It seems obvious. If two people need to solve the problem of the deer hunt and avoid falling into the risk-dominant outcome, they will have to think about each other. Yes, of course, they could choose not to think about each other, but then they will no longer be invited to the deer hunt, and they can continue chasing rabbits on their own. Different areas of the brain become active when we look for an explanation for another person's actions. Let's say you see a person entering a bank wearing a mask. What will you think of them and their intentions? In the pre-COVID era, you would likely assume they were a robber trying to hide their identity. But after March 2020, we have another option. The person may be protecting themselves from a deadly virus. Such causal analysis relies on modeling the mental state of the specific person. But which aspects of their mental state, MPS, come to your mind first depends on your own experience and biases, in other words, on your personal narrative. This is how MPS works. To model someone else's mental state, you turn to your own. In this case, it makes sense to hope that MPS will help us avoid the risk-dominant outcome in the deer hunt. After all, by mentally putting ourselves in the place of the other hunter, we should recognize the mutual benefits of cooperation. However, in reality, logic often turns out to be different. A participant in the deer hunt game might consider their partner as simply a random factor. In this case, there is no need to model the other's mental state. You can just take into account the probability that your partner will choose deer hunting or rabbit hunting and make your decision based on relative rewards and your willingness to take risks. For someone with this worldview, other people are somewhat like automatons, and their actions are seen as a matter of chance. Since the choice made by the player alone doesn't indicate whether they modeled the other person's mental state, we decided in our study to test whether fMRI would show a difference between two strategies, one involving MPS and one without. We hoped that MPS would manifest as activation in brain areas related to the functions I mentioned earlier. If the participant perceives the other player as a lottery element, only the brain structures related to risk and reward should activate. The first thing we noticed was the difference in the number of preferences dominant by reward deer hunting. In lottery games, participants chose the reward-dominant outcome 43% of the time. In the deer hunt game, that figure rose to 73%. In other words, simply realizing that you're playing against another person was enough to almost double the number of cooperative preferences, and, as we suspected, the deer hunt triggers different cognitive processes. These behavioral data clearly showed that there is a social interaction process involved in the deer hunt. We found two possible explanations for the results. It's possible that the key cognitive processes in both the deer hunt and the lottery are essentially the same, but the presence of another person, a partner, in the first case, makes the participant more likely to choose the reward-dominant option. Initially, we determined through neuroimaging which neural networks are involved in choosing the reward-dominant option, regardless of whether this occurred in the deer hunt game or the lottery. The analysis revealed a broad band of activity extending from the occipital cortex through the crown to the parietal lobe, covering areas involved in visual attention, as far as we know. The simplest explanation we could offer was this. Choosing the reward-dominant option required a close examination of the comparative value of the prize, and this necessity arose both in the deer hunt with a partner and in the impersonal lottery.